And all these medicines have their own kind of unique fractal of potentiality and how they unlock these unique gates of our own consciousness. Cannabis will do that uniquely. Ketamine will do that uniquely. MDMA, LSD, San Pedro, 5-MeO, all these different keys to unlocking these unique gates, because we're all these multifaceted, complex iterations of consciousness.
When I met clinical psychiatrist Dr. Dan Engle, MD, it was not in a clinic somewhere with a lab coat. He was actually on the land in Sedona, integrating a wild experience studying under an ayahuasquero down in Peru. Now, he tells some of this story on this podcast, but what was so intriguing to me is someone who was clinically trained in Western medicine, who then went into holistic medicine and then went into indigenous psychedelic plant medicine. And since then, 10 years ago, I've seen him and been alongside him, and we've been friends and allies as he's emerged as one of the top medicine doctors for psychedelic medicine and general holistic medicine. He recently published a book called A Dose of Hope about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And this is just a beautiful conversation with one of the great thought leaders in psychedelic medicine, Dr. Dan Engle, MD.
The truth is that we're all the master, we're all the healer, we're all the mystic.
Give it up one time for Aubrey Marcus.
Dr. Dan Engle, here we are.
Once again, brother.
Once again. So what was it, 12, 13 years ago when I found you in that dusty little clay hut out in Sedona, healing from doing way too much ayahuasca out in the jungle?
Yeah. You asked me after we had started having a great conversation.
Yeah.
You asked me if I wanted to get on a podcast. And I asked you, what's a podcast? And you said, wow, you've been out here a long time. First time I'd ever known about a podcast. And what was even happening in the outer world.
Yeah, what a propitious moment that was, where I met you and Anahata and Porangi, and really opened me up to so many different paths. Obviously, I'd already been on the psychedelic medicine path, which is one of the things that we connected on. But there were so many other modalities and ways of thinking, and from breath work to ecstatic dance to, so much that's just a regular part of my life, all came from, and key allies like yourself and everyone I mentioned, that all came from that moment.
Yeah. And Sedona too?
Sedona too, right? Yeah,
that was your first time out
drew
to
me
Sedona.
out to Sedona.
Wow.
And then by the second time I went to Sedona, I was like, I got to get a place out here. And now it's like my medicine home.
Amen, brother.
I know.
Yeah.
Not bad. And now here we are.
Yeah.
Lived a lot of life, done a lot of things.
100%. And for me too, to know you and to meet you then, because I was just very content building a hut. And the hut was rebuilding me after coming out of the jungle for a year. And didn't have any real vision about coming back out into the world and what that was going to look like. And then our meeting, and then the unfolding that happened for each of us through that connection. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was the first time I'd met an MD who had an equally proficient amount of experience and information in psychedelic medicine and also holistic medicine. Like, you were a real unicorn at that time, and it's still are in many ways, especially because you've just continued to advance your understanding of all of those fields. But back then, I mean, that was like, holy shit. This is the future of medicine. And I still think you represent this future archetype of medicine where it's like, cool, do what you need to do to get an MD, because there's some important tools that are in the toolbox when you can make prescriptions, and they have their place and they have their purpose. But they are severely limited when it comes to a real holistic understanding of human thriving.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, you're describing the sacred place at the table for all the medical paradigms, all the medical interventions. Yeah, after I broke my neck, I didn't go see my homeopath or my herbalist.
Your acupuncturist would not have been able to fucking
not
deal
in
with
that
it.
moment.
No.
After I was stabilized, halo screwed into skull. Okay, then hook me up with needles.
I don't need a very thin needle. I more need a screw
Right.
that's putting something into my head cranium.
Yeah. That kind of like allopathic approach triage, emergency care medicine. How do we stabilize a crisis situation? How do we use pharmaceuticals in the right way to arrest symptoms that are in that redlined crisis mode, stabilize fractures, really hold the human hardware system together while the energy body is catching up, and many of the associated interventional therapeutics that really help restore accelerated trajectory of full healing, because the body will heal itself as long as you stabilize it, give it the right conditions, and then there are things that accelerate and heal that and make it even more robust and ready.
Yeah, this is the thing that I think whenever you get almost evangelical with your belief system, where you think that the only way is the way that you do it. And this doesn't just happen in medicine. It can happen in fitness. It can happen in diet. Like love Paul Saladino. Think he's great. His whole carnivore thing, like a lot of respect. And I think he makes a lot of sense. And of course, Michaela Peterson and different people have had great benefits from moving to this dietary style. But it's like, all right, man, but you got to open your eyes to there's some other possibilities here that could be useful for other different situations.
100%.
From a keto situation to a vegan situation to just kind of like a balanced, high life force energy diet situation. It's not just the only thing. And I think it's great. It's fine to be a specialist, but I don't think it's the time of now. The time of now is actually being a polymath, is finding the best of all of the different fields and then having the broadest tool set, and also being able to draw connections from each type. Same thing with fitness. When I came in and founded On It, right, there was CrossFit, there was then regular gym lifting and then Olympic lifting, and then there was strictly kettlebells, and everybody was like, our way is the only way. And we're like, nah, how about all of it? How about a little bit of everything? And because that's the way athletes were really training anyways, when you really looked at it. And then top performers are also doing exactly what we're talking about. Both of us, you from a medical, more clinical side, but me from a spiritual and optimization side, working with literally the best athletes and best performers in the world. It's always a little bit of everything that's creating the best outcomes.
Yeah. It's been certainly a path for me to walk through these different dogmas. I think even when you and I met, I was raw vegan and had been for 5 years. And that was the prelude for me going down to the jungle, just cleaning, clarifying the channel, opening up the vessel, so to speak. And my first diet with Chitiksanango was just volumes of information coming through. But I was also dogmatic against allopathic medicine. So when...
It's like rebelling against your dad.
Yeah, I had to do that. I had to take it all the way to the other extreme.
Yeah, for sure.
Because once I found or was graced with the opportunity to experience ayahuasca, I learned more about myself in 1 weekend than I had in 1 decade of psychiatry training.
Yeah.
And I was inspired and I was pissed.
I bet.
Because we had just bastardized, as a psychiatric medical field, we'd bastardized all these sacred plant medicine technologies. And it was the first time that I felt hope in the future of mental health care, if we could be chakarunas, bridges of the allopathic field with the traditional medicine field. So I bounced over to the dogma against allopathic medicine, so to speak. And when I couldn't quite hold that third week of my Chitiksanango diet, and the channel was so open, and I hadn't slept for 3 weeks, and I was just downloading volumes of information, so to speak, on integrative psychiatry and medicine at large, I blew a circuit. My immune system shut down, got septic, and I wouldn't take antibiotics. So I came back and tried to figure out, my rationale was okay, I'm septic. If this was 100 years ago, pre-penicillin, what would I do?
And your body's like, you die, stupid. That's what you would do.
I was on that threshold. So I found, mega doses of colloidal silver, honey pack poultices, some herbal therapies that helped me, get back on the healing trajectory. And then I was able to go back down to the jungle, finish up that Chittick diet.
So you actually moved through that. You moved through that portal without ever using antibiotics.
Yeah.
You fought your way through it.
Yeah.
That's bold.
It was probably a little reckless in the past. I mean, like with past kind of
You
hindsight.
reckless, Dan? No, you don't
Well,
push the edges at all.
It's good to know how far we can go,
Dr.
right?
Conservative.
Yeah. What is it? I think Terrence McKenna describes the definition of a shaman, and I would not categorize myself at that. But the definition of the shaman is the one in the community that goes to the edge of the known, jumps off into the abyss, has an experience, comes back and tells everybody what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And there has been that kind of just inclination to see what's on the other side of the known.
Yeah.
And so 15 years ago, when I started this path of ayahuasca apprenticeship and learning about these different medicine technologies, there wasn't much of a script. And I don't think I would have wanted to follow anybody else's script anyway. I think it's good to get different comparatives, like Richard Evans Schulte's experiences in the deep Amazon. Like if you watch that documentary Embracing the Serpent.
Oh yeah, it's good.
It's so good, and you just see kind of like the first exploration of the deep medicine process, where she comes from or where the medicines come from.
Mm-hmm.
There's something really sacred about being able to work with the lineage holders of those ways, like El Dragon, recently with our time in Soltara.
And also to be careful. You got cursed.
I did.
You got cursed.
Yeah.
And this is something that I don't like to talk too much about, because I think there's also, of course, as we know, when the mind gets an idea, you can start believing all kinds of things, and the belief in those things can create a reality in which you actually believe that you're cursed, and then you need some external help to actually relieve you of this condition. But however, I've seen it, I saw it with Whitney, and I've told that story many times, and you experienced it as well, where there are shamans, who you would call them sorcerers, I suppose, or brujos, yeah, which is like the male version of a witch, but not a witch in like the awesome way that we sometimes use the word these
not
days.
Not Glinda, the good witch of the north.
No, exactly. But you experience some dark medicine. And so explain what that was doing. And this is just a general caveat, like be mindful. There's those that are looking to heal you and those that are looking to eat you. And it's just like the jungle. And you don't even have to apply your own morality and say they're bad or good. It's like, is the jaguar bad or good? Well, it depends on if you're a fucking tapir.
Right.
If you're a tapir, that's bad. And a tapir is like a little anteater, little animal that digs around for ants. Like a jaguar is a fucking menace. It's a villain. But if you're like another cool jaguar, it might be like, ooh, sexy.
Yeah.
That's hot.
Yeah. Right. So it's all perspective at that point. And some of the teachers or those that come into our lives to be reflections of our own power and our own integrity and our own value system, sometimes those medicine teachings come in really uncomfortable ways. And I went down really naive. I went down, I was coming out of 25 years of schooling, up through college, med school, residency, fellowships. And in that Western kind of orientation to education, we apply for a position, particularly med school, residency, and fellowships. You apply for a position and you try and let the governing board or the admissions council, you want them to know why you're going to be the best applicant.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of an extraction. And we could maybe think of that as like a self-promotion model. And I had that. I wasn't aware that I had that, but I still had that as my orientation to ayahuasca apprenticeship. So when I went down, I first studied with the guy who's largely regarded as the king of the hill in ayahuasca shamanism and the Shipibo lineage. And I went to study with him, had heard amazing things. And I'm high as a kite. And I'm looking for a teacher because I'm looking for a mentor along these paths, and I'm willing to go all in.
Yeah.
And so in the midst of a ceremony, I had premeditated this kind of exchange, although I didn't know how it was going to unfold. I made a little mesa, and I'm super high in Aya space, and it's in the middle of the ceremony, and I kind of like crawl over to his little mat. And my broken my broken Spanish, and I'm trying to English translate essentially like, I would like to be your student. But the way it came out is, tú es mi maestro. You're my teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, huh? And I said, and I repeated it, tú es mi maestro. And he goes, huh? And I presented my little mesa and proceeded to go back to my mat. And then I was there for my first diet, and I was there for a month. And then he kind of ignored me for the rest of the month that I was there. And then there was a lot of other things, and it was clear that it wasn't like the right connection. Mm. But it was only months later, once I found a different teacher, and there was a whole lot of things that led me to leave that original place and not study more fully with the original guy. Mm-hmm. But it was only months later that I realized just the audacity and my privilege to walk into a sacred space that had been held for lineage and years of an unbroken line of ayahuasca shamanism, for me to walk in and demand that this guy be my teacher. Mm-hmm. I could tell in retrospect how that came off. And I was reading Wade Davis's book, One River, at the time when it dawned on me. And Wade Davis talks about the colonialization that happened when the white man goes down into the Amazon as an extractive orientation towards the ownership of natural resources. First, it was for rubber. And you see that in Embracing the Serpent, like just the atrocities. First, it was for rubber, then it was for oil, and now it's for ayahuasca. And I was just continuing that like extractive mindset, as opposed to saying like, wow, I really appreciate how you orchestrate the field. I would love to learn from you. Would you accept me and have me as a student? Right. Totally different orientation. So the choques and the blockages and that kind of like brujudillo that happened as a result may have been related to now that I had placed this little mesa together. I had said, you're my teacher. And there's something when somebody's holding a diet, it's kind of like the elder holding the fire for somebody on the vision quest on the mountain.
And for those people who are wondering, a diet is also called a dieta. It's where you're in deep spiritual contact with sometimes a psychoactive plant, sometimes a non-psychoactive plant. Doesn't even necessarily need to be a plant, but you spend your every waking minute, as much as you can of the day, isolating yourself and focusing your thought and your consciousness to interact with that plant or that energy that you're looking for, to bring that energy home inside your energetic field. Mm-hmm. And so this is a technology they use, which they learn Icaros, they learn how to use the medicine of whatever they've been in contact with, their dieta, and then offer that as part of their medicine bag. So when we reference diet, just for people who don't know, that's what we're talking about. Not talking about raw vegans or anything like that. Although it is a pretty restrictive food diet that you go on, just to stay really clear.
Yeah. Yeah. Good description. Beautiful description of the dieta. And when we slow our metabolic system, our psychological system, our energetic system down to the pace of nature, then we can make more direct communion with the natural world and listen to the teachings, the medicine, receive the medicine of the particular plant that we're dieting. Mm. And so in that process, I have this extractive orientation. I present something that are my own sacred objects to this person and demand that he be my teacher. Well, there can be, just like Yoda says to Luke Skywalker, there's the light side of the Force and then there's the dark side of the Force. And there are those that will take advantage of somebody like me in a naive position, so that if I'm making an energetic connection with somebody who's holding my diet, that person also has kind of like ownership of my diet, can actually harvest the energy that I'm receiving through the plants for his own medicine basket. It's kind of like a siphoning off of the energetic body.
Vampiric.
It's a bit vampiric. And I didn't realize that was in place for years.
And it was actually, so how it manifested, I was actually even drinking ayahuasca with you while that was still in place. And you actually would not be able to actually interact with the light of the medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes for the majority of the lights, the candles would be lit back in the Maloka, and you're like, yep, nothing yet. It'll come later, around maybe 3, 4, or 5 a.m. or something like that. I'll get a little taste of it when, but in this framework, and I know this sounds crazy, and obviously understand that this Dr. Dan Engle is a medical doctor and a psychiatrist here. So understand that we're not prone to this woo-woo nonsense unless we've actually felt it and experienced it. And in this experience, what is for sure is that you had that block. And then what we surmise, although we haven't experienced this directly, is that energy, and this is what the lore of ayahuasca explains, is that energy can be harvested. That the unutilized surplus energy and experience of all the light that could come from the medicine can be actually harvested non-locally through, the interconnected field by the person who placed the blockage.
Yeah. And I wasn't conscious that this blockage was there. I was conscious that after this exchange happened, to your point, I didn't have any visual experiences in the medicine space. And if they came, they were mild. And if they came, they were well after the ceremony even closed. So and this was happening for years. And then I just happened to be at the Temple of the Way of Light. And Donald, mutual friend, he and I stopped by the Belen market and picked up some mapachos. And I had never worked with Toy, which is also datura or angel's trumpet. And it's a pretty powerful medicine. But there was a draw to working with it, and it was rolled in tobacco leaf. And that night I had a mapacho with Toy, and it will imbue this very lucid dream state. And in that dream, that night, first night we got to the temple, Don Howard comes to me in the dream time, had never seen him in dreams before. And clear as day, looks straight at me and says, "You have a blockage. It's from one of your old teachers, and you need to take care of that while you're here." And then bounced out of the dream. It was that clear, that direct. And it was notable. So the next morning, I mentioned this to Matthew, who runs the Temple of the Way of Light. And I mentioned to him the dream time. He goes to Don Francisco, who was their kind of head shaman. And we were going to sit that night. So he had kind of like let Don Francisco know that there may need to be some kind of extra work potentially to support me. So Don Francisco, in the middle of that night's ceremony, he comes around as they do. They'll kind of work the circle, and you receive icaros from each of the facilitators. And Don Francisco kind of lays into this icaro and is really beautiful. And then it kind of builds in intensity, builds in cadence, builds in strength, builds in power. And I can feel like I'm a bit of a pressure cooker, and the energy's building, like something's building. It wasn't a purge, but it was like the energy just started kind of like raising and vibrating through, but it was a bit of a stuckness. And then he lays in to I'm really high, so maybe I was biased, but it seemed to be one of the more long, strong icaros I had experienced. And then all of a sudden it reaches this crescendo and something lets go. And all of a sudden, the entire visual landscape opened up in ways that it hadn't since my earliest days, years before. Whoosh, just the fractal beauty of what we know that kind of fractal landscape can look like. And I just felt whole and free and light and inspired and in awe and reverent. And also just like, what the heck just happened? And from that ceremony forward to this day, the visual landscape is available to me again. And so that next morning in our harvest circle, I wanted to know, like, Don Francisco, what the heck just happened? And I knew that my Spanish wasn't going to like communicate or, so Matthew was the translator, and Don Francisco essentially said that when he was singing to me, the Icaro wouldn't penetrate. And so he was kind of looking around, and that you get these energy eyes. You can kind of see the energetic field, the auric field, however we choose to language it. And there's certain trees, like Lupuna Blanca, will offer like that kind of energetic, almost X-ray vision. And he could see the energy was like a steel plate, like a manhole cover over my kind of heart space, the frontal body of my energetic field. And he had to, the way he described it is he put spiritual dynamite underneath this manhole. And then when he was singing in, he was layering more and more around it. And then it came to a threshold and it just exploded. And so he was able to remove that choke or that blockage. And one of the energetic forces of that Icaro was Jesus Cristo, was Jesus. And I didn't know that Don Francisco had dieted the Bible for 6 months, right? So you can diet plants and you can also diet like the sacred texts. It's just receiving energy and information. So it's kind of like rising above that fourth plane astral shenanigan into the fifth plane, unconditional love, which kind of like energetically the fifth plane might kind of trump the fourth. And so because of that, and I'd worked with dozens and dozens of other teachers and facilitators prior, between the first teacher and Don Francisco, and none of them were able to either see it or maybe I wasn't ready. And so with that release, it really helped me appreciate that first teacher for me and everything that had happened between then and working and sitting with Don Francisco, that was all for me. That was for me. Much of that time, and I was also in a year of a suicidal depression right before I met you when I moved back from the jungle. And that was a hard reintegration because I couldn't deal with society and just the way we live and our culture so fast and So all of that was a recognition, because that whole time, that 5-year process of what that was for me was the consistent prayer. And in my meditation and all my prayers up to that point was, I know I'll trust my power to come back when it's anchored in 4 aspects. And those became my hands and my feet, how I walk in the world. Humility, integrity, reverence, and gratitude. Humility, integrity, reverence, and gratitude. And that became kind of like the medicine wheel of stepping back into power and knowing how to use that in a good way. So that first teacher for me was my best teacher in understanding that the shamanic path is a power path. It's not a spiritual path. It's up to us to imbue our power in the world with spiritual virtues and values so that we're actually here to be givers and not takers, usually like Daniel Quinn, Ishmael kind of reference. Are we here to support a harmonious society? Are we here to leave things better than when we found them kind of approach? And so it was a total reframe for me of moving from, and I don't think in those years I was necessarily working from a victim mentality, but in retrospect, it did certainly help me move from the experience like life is happening to me, that life is happening for me. Yeah. And I can be a participant and then a student and then a teacher of the path. And so it was like this progressive process. So in my experience, even the hardest lessons that we don't understand why they're happening and we just want to like curse whoever we project is responsible for it, life is still happening for us. And we don't know the soul level kind of orientation towards our life mastery oftentimes until retrospect, when we can see that the worst thing that has happened to us oftentimes is actually the best thing. And when our traumas become our allies, now we essentially become invincible.
Through my crazy travel schedule, I have learned that I want to travel light and effective. And one of the best ways to do that is to travel with all of Onnit's Instant collection. Alpha Brain Instant, New Mood Instant, Hydratech. It's super easy. All you do is you tear off the little strip here, you pour it in water, and you get the instant effects of these formulas that we worked on for a decade. Formulas that I don't want to leave home without, that can help, in the case of Alpha Brain, get you more focused, put you in this productive flow so you can get the shit done that you want to get done. And of course, New Mood to help you relax, stay calm, stay centered. It's the great yin yang of the Onnit formulas. And of course, Hydrotech, anytime you're sweating, working out hard, all of these are available. Onnit.com/Aubrey, and you'll save 10%. Once again, that's Onnit.com/Aubrey. This is the classic stoic approach. The obstacle is the way that challenging thing becomes our greatest, the diamond grindstone that's forging the sword of our soul, right? Like this is the thing that supports us in that way. And it's interesting. It requires us to believe that for it to be true, actually.
Totally.
And that's the funny part about the world is we look at these things like, well, is that true? Is it happening for you or to you? Well, it depends on what you believe. And whatever you believe is right.
Right.
That classic wisdom, like whatever you believe, you're correct.
Totally.
And that's how powerful belief is.
Totally.
Ultimately. And it's been beautiful to watch you and learn from you and also contribute and be your ally in every different way as we've navigated these waters together, because there's not a lot of people that I know that are willing, like myself, to go to the edge and go like, oh, okay, what's over the edge? And we talked about this recently. We shared some ceremony space recently, and I was in a particularly deep journey that was taking me all the way through the realms of hell to see if I could see the light, that was hidden in the crevices and in the shadows, to see if I could see the divine all the way through. The guiding line was nobody knows hell better than God. God, the ubiquitous, presence, the omnipresence and omnipotence of all things, right? That capital L love, the substrate of the universe itself. Of course, it knows the darkness better than anything, right? And so it was like, it would have to. And I understood, okay, nobody knows hell better than God. Well, if I'm trying to walk the divine path and embrace our own inner divinity, which, by the way, I have to say, anybody who's getting tripped about exploring their own divinity, it's cool. Explore it. Recognize the divine in yourself. You're going to get really fucked up the moment that you think that you have some part of the divine that's different than anybody else.
Totally.
Do not fall victim to that trap where you say, I've got something divine and you don't. And as soon as you do that, you're fucking lost. And you're going into a dead-end ego trap, and that's very fucking dangerous. So just throwing that caveat out there, but encouraging everybody.
Righteousness.
It is. It's the biggest problem. It's it's not the biggest, but it's a very big problem is when you start to measure and quantify your own divinity and then judge that in ratio with another. You've lost the whole point of the divine that infuses everything. But anyways, that being said, as I try to walk the path to understand my own portion of this divinity that we all share, I'm really keen on taking the path wherever the path wants to lead. And it's been leading me into exploration of the deepest, darkest shadows and the deep points of how deeply can you look into the darkness, into the abyss. And I remember I went to my own room, and I didn't bring any of I have my own shamanic toolkit that I've cultivated over 23 years. I have a special rock, and I have a special quiver of hape, and I have my cinnamon that I've dieted in the way that we've talked about, where I've forged connection with that. I have my rose oil from another plant that I've dieted. I have special beads that represent my dear allies in this 3D world and beyond, and of all this. But I went into the room with none of it. And I went into this, and you shared a very interesting story, which I think is worth sharing about this journey into descent into the darkness and actually going naked and the importance of that. I could have gone out and got that, but I was already in the shit of it. And there was moments where I would get really actually kind of scared. And when I would get scared, it felt like my fear was justified. Again, that what you believe. You're right.
True.
When I was scared, it was yeah, this is dangerous. And then I was I have total faith. Then I was everything was cool. And I was working with that. And it was bringing me through the portals of disgust. This idea that which you are disgusted of, you're unable to see the light within it. You're unable to see the divine that's within that thing that disgusts you. So it's showing me the most horrifically disgusting things like unbelievable. Sometimes I just had to chuckle at just the pure creativity of the horror that was appearing in my visions. And, you know, making it through that. But there was this feeling, and I felt really good since, like the result. And always, I think you can tell something by the aftertaste also is such a good telling of whether it was a fruitful journey or not. Is like, what's the aftertaste? Like, how do you feel? Do you feel more alive? Do you feel more in love? But it brought me through. And I remember us talking, and you were asking, like, you know, you were talking to me like, do you feel like you have enough support? I'm always here, like, as a true ally to the end, as a brother that you are. And I was like, yeah, I feel good. You know, I know it's intense, but there's this feeling that if you could make it through that darkness portal, you could actually connect the loop of polarity. So polarity being of a pole, imagine it like a stick. And that's how we usually imagine it. Dark on one side, light on the other side. But in actuality, I think those things bend into a circle. And if you can run the lap where you can see the light and the dark through everything and then run the lap and then make that like a spiral, it felt like this really interesting and also, you know, somewhat treacherous path. You have to be mindful, because I also got, you know, some hits on the quote from Nietzsche, which is paraphrasing, but it's, you know, be mindful of staring into the abyss, lest the abyss stare back into you.
Amen.
And so I was like, okay, be mindful. But then I was at a certain point where the abyss was staring back at me. And then I was like, well, now what? You know, like, lest the abyss stare back into you. And I'm like, okay.
It's happening.
Now what? Here we are.
Here we are.
Here we are.
We're going to have a conversation.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a cool experience. And of course, was really grateful to have you and, you know, so much family there coming out of it. And and you shared a story that was, I think, really, really kind of potent about, you know, just the synchronicities that happen when you're listening and in these journeys. And about there was a myth about a goddess who would descend into the underworld. Yeah, why don't you share that story, because I thought that was cool.
Yeah,
when I came out of there.
Well, I want to also just recognize your path and your journey. It takes a lot of courage and willingness to go that deep into the darkness, because it's a deep rabbit hole, and it will bring up, by design, all of our greatest fears and our attachments, and we can get lost there.
Yeah.
And so it does take mindfulness. It takes courage. It takes massive faith. You know, the ability to believe in something without evidence, you know, like whatever it is that we believe is true becomes true. So I want to recognize that for you in that warrior spirit to see what's here, because there is an adversarial energy that is anti-life.
Yep.
Because that's the natural polarity of the pro-life energy, the creative force in the universe. There's a light side of the force, the dark side of the force. I mean, Star Wars, it was just like this epic kind of like orientation of the nature of reality. And it takes a lot of willingness to come face to face with the anti-life kind of energetic, which we might call the adversary or the opposition.
Yeah, and where it gets real intense, of course, is you have to see that is within you. We love externalizing the darkness.
Yeah.
Oh, this demon over here, or this darkness that's outside everywhere else. But when you actually peer in, where it gets scary is what it's showing you is a mirror. And I had this kind of download about this, where this understanding of Lucifer as the light bringer, it's always this kind of strange language, like the light bringer. What does that even mean? This is the embodiment of anti-life, of darkness, of all of this. But what the understanding was, it was, oh no, I'm just a mirror that is showing you the darkness that's within you. The latent possibility of all of that darkness doesn't mean that you're expressing it, but it's within the full spectrum, as full spectrum, entire polarity beings of the entire loop of all of creation, all of consciousness. All is mind, the universe is mental, the sum total of the conscious minds in the universe is one, all of this wisdom, right? It's like, the light bringer is actually bringing you a mirror so that you can see the darkness that's within you. And that's where you get the flinch because you're like, that ain't me. No way.
Right.
No way. But it's there.
Right.
As well as all the light.
Right.
All the light, all the dark.
We have the seed of creation within us and the full spectrum. I love that term, full spectrum, like full spectrum medicine. This is full spectrum consciousness. And we have the opportunity to enter the gate at whichever shade of gray between those two polar opposites, right? Like one of those hermetic principles on polarity. The opposites are the same, they just differ in degree.
Yeah.
Right? So this is consciousness, differs in degree. And the willingness to go in and honor that and see it within ourselves and become right with that, become clear with that. Like we could enter the dark path, so to speak, whatever that means. Distorted. It essentially just means illusion or separate from consciousness. And that at the end of the day, it is the adversary. It is that darkness that is the actual honing of our light.
Of our light, yeah.
Just like the only thing that can really cement and deepen the strength of our faith is our doubt. The only thing that can really strengthen and empower our greatness is the opposition. And so to become right with that and still to know how to find our way out, because that darkness, that energetic thread goes down into countless unfolding opportunities to come into our great fear of annihilation. And so the myth of Inanna, when she ventures into the underworld, she systematically takes off all of her armor, her sword, her shield, all of her clothes. She ventures into the darkness, eventually becomes annihilated, and then eventually becomes resurrected to come back. And it's such this powerful myth. And it's easy to glamorize it to an extent too. Like, oh, wow, that sounds amazing. I'd love to have a hero's journey. It's like, well, if you're wanting to have a hero's journey, then you don't really know what it's about because your ego is going to get annihilated.
The annihilation is real.
It's real.
That's the thing. It's like...
And the ego doesn't know the difference between annihilation and transformation.
Yeah.
Because it experiences them as the same. We go through this annihilating process so that we can deprogram all of the ego constructs that we were imbued with transgenerationally, collectively, and then in our inception and how we were reared. We have to systematically get deprogrammed of all of those things to come back into our inherent nature. And that process is absolutely annihilating. It's completely disorienting. It's not a linear path. It's highly uncomfortable and it's highly inconvenient. So in our culture, we don't really have a time or a space for that. And that's part of the shadow side of psychiatry. We have reduced psychiatry in the mind to like neurochemical profiles of twisting these little widgets in pharmaceutical medicine to expect that this is going to take care of the underlying symptoms, which might be the fact that we are products of a society that's a bit off the rails.
Shit. Even saying underlying symptoms is actually not necessarily what the field is doing. They're actually looking at clinical diagnoses of a disease in the DSM, which is a bunch of dudes around a table going like, is this a disease? And they're like, what do you think, Bob? Bob's like, I think it's a disease. And like, what do we got for it? I don't know. Let's put some pharmas behind it and let's figure it out. Like it's a disease state almost like, so it's this idea that you're treating a disease rather than, okay, here's some symptoms. Let's look at the symptoms. Let's see the source of the symptoms. It just feels like we're so focused on the disease classification that it's not even like, what's actually fucking happening here?
Yeah.
What's going on in your life? Like, how's your body? What's your diet? Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
What are you feeling? It's like disease state, rubber stamp this, and then there's a solution that'll fit that rubber stamp, except it's not working. We're just getting sicker and sicker and sicker.
With all the fancy pharmaceuticals, we have no better outcomes than 100 years ago. If you look at schizophrenia as being like the bad boy kind of, the ultimate disease kind of presentation of mental health in our culture today, schizophrenia, our outcome measures today are no better than they were 100 years ago. before all the fancy pharmaceuticals, when actually at that time, we tried the best we could do to keep people safe and then put them into work, hands in the dirt, come back to nature, come back to like some degree of reconnection. And schizophrenia and that kind of like that darkness of feeling lost is kind of the penultimate experience psychically of disconnection. Disconnection from ourselves, from one another, from known reality. But what is really happening at the deeper level of psyche, or we might even say soul, that's actually working on behalf of that person's evolved process of their own personal development and their own personal mastery. Like if we think about in the known universe or multiverse, everything is on an evolutionary trajectory. Why would our consciousness not be on an evolutionary trajectory? Why would not our soul, the experience of consciousness before and after a body, also not have an evolutionary trajectory? And then we get into these philosophical kind of orientations to what does soul-centered medicine look like? What is the appreciation for a particular blueprint that we might come in with? Yes, we have historical experience. We might call that karma. We have the current experience. We might call that persona. Like triplets born into a family, they're all very unique because they all have their own unique soul. They have their own unique persona. And then we come in with what we're here to do, our sacred gift. We might call that dharma. So these are aspects of soul. And we can start to appreciate the fact that there might be something happening evolutionarily, where there might be the trajectory of certain soul imprints to attain a certain developmental arc of learning and growth towards self-mastery, where the arc of the soul's longevity might just include one lifetime as like a day, so to speak, in a given lifehood. These trajectory experiences where we're constantly evolving our experience of unity and the ability to see both light and dark, like as above, so within. Another hermetic principle that it all exists within us.
The law of correspondence.
And the law of correspondence.
And with that, it doesn't mean that we don't get to decide what we learn. There's so many ways to learn. And like our soul's like, how do you want to learn? Like, which way do you want to go? Oh, pain teacher? Great. We got loads of that. Trauma teacher? Perfect. Oh, love teacher? Joy teacher? Laughter teacher? Great. How about it? So it's like, how do we want to learn in this life? But also, you can't do it wrong as from a learning perspective. Now, of course, you can hurt people, which is that's where you have to be mindful. That's like the only hard rule to the game of how you can really do it wrong is malice, is buying into the delusion and distortion of separation, of believing that person you're hurting is not you, or that person you're cheating is not you living a different life. That distortion, I think it's a way to learn from that grandest, highest purview perspective, but it also fucks with other people's ability to have the sovereign choice of how they learn. And I think so, as long as you respect those boundaries, like you can't really do it wrong. It's just, how do you want to do it? And I think people can this is one thing that I've seen in relationships with some of the most spiritually brilliant and deep and potent, people that I've ever known. They'll be in a relationship that just is not really serving them from my perspective, and they'll acknowledge the ways that it's not serving them. But they'll be like, this is my teacher. I'm learning through being starved of this type of affection. I'm learning through not being met intellectually or spiritually, and then working every day on my forgiveness and unconditionality of love as I get continued affront after affront. And I'm like, well, I can't argue with you from a philosophical standpoint. Totally. You're right. However, there's lots of other awesome ways to learn where you're like, fuck, I love you so much. That was amazing. And you can learn through a different path, so it's like we can learn from anything. And in those situations where we don't have a choice, then acceptance is the requisite choice. Like, of course, accept it. but also claim your ability to choose how you want to learn as much as you can. So it's both. It's like, it's that paradoxical
100%.
thing. Like everything is a teacher, but also choose your teacher, just like your original story. Like,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right before I met you, I was just coming out of a dark time right after I moved back from the jungle. And I was in a dark moment, passively suicidal. Like, it was just like the darkness was overwhelming. I didn't know this choke was in place and this blockage. And it was also integration. And I was disidentified with who I had been, and I was not yet who I was going to become. Very much the liminal space, this underworld process. And I was graced, I still don't know how. One day, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning book showed up on my little altar in my little tent. Still don't know how it got there. And I read that at just the right time.
wow.
And to your point, Viktor Frankl found himself in this just horrendous experience, didn't have control over the situation, in a concentration camp in Auschwitz, had already wrote his kind of treatise on logotherapy, meaning-oriented therapy. And at that point, it was essentially Freud and Jung having these two primary kind of psychological orientations to therapy. And this was the third. And then he got the laboratory experience of it, which was the concentration camp.
Yeah.
And he saw that through that process, those that were able to live through it found meaning in it. And not only acceptance, but also meaning. And the kind of summary statement, the summary quote in that book that for me has always been like the treatise for my life since then and now moving forward, the last of the great human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. And to know that he lived that, it wasn't just like some philosophical diatribe. He lived it. And I knew that we all are made of the same stuff. And so in that moment, he had set the bar. And now my excuses for feeling petty about my current situation just seemed like trivial.
Yeah.
And it was an inspired recognition. He became one of my teachers, no longer in a body. And he did through that book. And many others have written similar kind of treatises on our ability to choose our attitude and our experience and find meaning in it. So for me, the three maxims of living are: number one, love is our blueprint. Number two, choice is our power. And number three, life is our school. And for those three, if I just try those on in any kind of like orientation, come back to the fact that love is the blueprint of creation. And we're always just a little net positive against the adversary. Otherwise, this whole thing wouldn't continue. It would. Yeah. Thankfully, we keep propagating.
Well, we're not, and I think just to bracket a little piece, I think one of the reasons why we're net positive is the adversary requires distortion. It literally requires distortion. I mean, there is the destruction, which is a necessary part of creation, which is not
death and
distortion.
decay. Yeah.
Of course, the explosion of a star, all of that. That's not distortion. That's just existence. But the adversary is the anti-life energy, is the thing that tries to tear down that which is being built and that which is beautiful, not because it needs to be torn down, but because it just wants to. It requires the distortion, the delusion that we are not all interconnected. It requires the delusion of separation. So if your entire platform is built upon a fundamental lie, you're always going to be a little bit behind a platform that's built on a fundamental truth, which is that everything is connected. And that's why all of the stories say the good always wins. Why does the good always win? Well, it's got a platform that's built on truth, whereas the other one's got a faulty platform. It requires distortion, and that distortion can be illuminated at any point in time, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh shit, what have I been doing all this time being the adversary? I've fucked it up. Whereas with the truth, of course you can become distorted, but the truth is is a solid platform and a solid pillar, which is why I think it does win in the end.
Yeah.
Which is why I have a lot of confidence actually in the way that the world is going. It's sure there's lots of distortion here, but distortion is vulnerable. And the truth is, it might be hard to find sometimes. It might be forgotten or lost, or discarded, but it's stable, it's solid, and it's always there. And you look deep enough, you're going to find it.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. Well said. Yeah. It's the constant orientation to finding our faith, orienting towards this radically empowered position that life is happening for me, not to me, and then evolving that kind of trajectory into life is happening for me, life is happening with me, and then life is happening as me. It's this we each are the center of our known universes. And we look deep inside the quantum reality of the known universe. The universe is expanding from every position simultaneously. Wow. When I first heard that, Joseph Selby wrote a really good book called The Physics of God. And that little pearl just kind of stood out like, wow, how can the universe be expanding from every point simultaneously? That means literally we are each the point of expansion of the known universe in this inception. And so now, if that can become a basis of my new philosophy and my new way of living, then it's easier to accept my power and also my responsibility, to your point. How am I living my life? To what degree of harmony? To what degree of service? To what degree of connection? And can I accept each of those adversarial experiences as also a teacher? Can I experience each of those shadow positions that I might externally point to and say are wrong? Can I also turn that dark mirror and look at it within myself, inside myself? And then it becomes this really powerful process of becoming completely responsible for our own lives. And ideally having this radical faith that ultimately we're winning the game, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know, like we've won the grand test or the big war. There's still battles to fight. There will still be adversaries and challenges because we're still in a body. And yet I don't want to get numb to the role that I have to play, my own small yet important role on the grand chessboard. I remember I just had a flash of you and I playing three-dimensional chess that one day.
For sure.
Literally, that was a three-dimensional chess game. And can I accept and own the responsibility for my life to live it to the best of my ability in a good way, to have faith that what is moving through me at any given moment is actually in service to my greatest opportunity, my greatest becoming, my greatest evolution, and ultimately my greatest mastery.
Yeah.
And it's hard to continue to hold that, particularly in the culture that we live in, because it's so fast-paced. It's so aggressive in many ways. It's so like the neurologic onset of the click rates and the speed of our technology. Our nervous systems have not caught up to the speed of our technology. So at times it can feel really overwhelming. And
Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology is the way I've heard it described.
Nice.
Yeah.
Say that to me again.
Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology.
Wow. Right.
That's the spot we're in right now.
That's such a soup.
Yep. And as they said in it's that movie with George Clooney that's about the Odyssey. Fucking, you know which movie I'm talking about? It's like George Clooney. It's in the Soggy Bottom Boys.
Oh, yeah. Oh, brother, where art thou?
Oh, brother, where art
That's
thou?
so good.
Or he's up in the fucking window and they're shooting guns at him, and he's going,
"Oh, we're in a fix.
Damn, we're in a tight spot. Damn, we're in a tight spot." Like that's we're in a tight spot.
Yeah, we're in a tight spot, and what a glorious place to be, but and also what a dynamic time in human history, and so that we also don't become numb to the degree of travesty and mass shootings, and like we become normalized to that.
Yeah,
and I think of Krishnamurti. He's kind of like constantly in the back of my ear. It's no degree of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. And so we don't want to become numb to the atrocities that are happening. Like, so how do we feel it all and still be buoyant?
Right.
and still choose our attitude.
It's almost like you have to do it as like a empathy ceremony, like put a ceremonial context around it where it's like, I'm going in to feel all of it now and feel it, connect with it, grieve it. And this is what I've found to be really productive. It's like, go in because it's important to feel it all. We have to, but we also can't carry it with us. Just like we can't carry our mushroom vision with us in day-to-day life. It'd be overwhelming, or you can't bring an ayahuasca ceremony. You got to go into the ceremony, feel it all, be in a place where you allow yourself to fully feel it, open your heart to the maximum to feel the pain, and then give yourself the permission to close it back. But I think people don't trust themselves that if they open the gate that they'll be able to close it, or they just don't want to open the gate because it's uncomfortable to feel it. But it's important because that's the motivation that causes us to want to change things. If we don't feel it, we're not going to have any desire to actually change it. It'll be like, all right, whatever, this thing happened. Let me just worry about my next paycheck or whatever the thing is that I'm worried about. And then we're not going to have the hot-blooded, passionate desire to change. We gotta connect. We have to. But I think finding that skill to put it in a place where we can go in all the way and feel all of it, connect with all of it, and then trust ourselves that we can put that back and wrap that back up and say, okay, that was my ceremony where I could feel the pain of the world, or I could feel the pain of those who've experienced this thing. And I can't carry that with me. Otherwise it'll pull me down with it and I won't be able to exist.
Yeah. Such the dance, coming in and out, getting in touch with the degree of the suffering in the world and using that as fuel and motivation to do our work versus fuel and motivation to feel like, well, what's it all about anyway? Why should I even care?
Right.
Such the dance.
Yeah. All of this is about like, I mean, one of the things that my own foray into the darkness has really shown me, and I'm not meaning that literally. I did do obviously a darkness retreat, which was literal darkness, and I'm using that in the metaphor being that the distortion, the hell realms, and being asked to see myself in the mirror when I looked through all of these hell realms. And like, there's something about all of us, all of our identities. We all want to be the good guy or the good girl. Like we all want to be inherently good, right? Like it's this obsession with being inherently good. And I remember the first time I was disposed of this identity predisposition was the second time I sat with Maestro Orlando the dragon. And this giant dragon with a head the size of a gigantic building it was a gray dragon made of smoke, comes straight down and looks over me and just looks at me and goes, "You want power?" And I go, yeah. And I thought that was pretty honest of me to admit at that point. It was like, I don't know, is this the right answer? Is he going to fuck me up? And the dragon goes, "Why?" And I go, to help people. The classic power for. Power for good things. And the dragon goes, "Are you sure?" And then I without even, any will, I jump on his back. It just happened. I just jump on his back and he brings me through this entire scan of my life of all the times that I've used power for my own benefit or power over or power in these ways. And I was like, damn, I guess I want power not only for good, but also for me to ball out at a fucking club or whatever, whatever the thing it was showing me was. I don't even remember what it was showing me. And it was that first moment of recognizing okay, here's some aspect of myself that isn't all good, isn't all saintly, and but it was super important to realize that. And I think in this journey, instead of trying to constantly scramble to pretend that we're all good, to understand that we're very complicated, multifaceted beings, and to see that we have this dark capacity. For example, one of the pathways that it showed me is we despise the idea of sadistic pleasure, which is the pleasure in somebody else's pain, right? That's the epitome of what we would call an evil action, pleasure in somebody else's pain. Okay. Now imagine that you're watching a movie and there's a villain, and the villain is massacring villages of kids and babies, and they fuck with the main character and they kill his daughter and his family, and he's the most despicable villain. And then he gets finally captured by the hero, and they bring him in, and then they goes and they say, "And your death will not be slow." And everybody in the audience is like, "Yeah, give it to him. Pull his fingernails out." You know? Well, what the fuck is that? That's pleasure in somebody else's pain, except we've gone through the journey where we feel like that fucker deserves it. So like even something simple like that is to understand like we're capable of pleasure in someone else's pain. And throughout history, always there's just been a slippery slope of scapegoating that has justified some other access to sadistic pleasure, just like the movie justified it in our mind when the hero says, and your death won't be quick. We're like, fuck yeah. Well, what if it was the Jews that are tearing down our society? Or what if it was the witches that are in league with Satan? Let's burn them or let's torture them. What if it's happened a billion times where those things have been justified and then sadistic pleasure has been unleashed. So, but to see that and to see that as a capable human trait, obviously we don't have the ability to be scapegoated to that degree, although certainly, we've seen some crazy shit in the past few years.
Yeah.
But to recognize that and recognize and see those tendrils of the ability to be dark or evil within the self, it may be scary to look at that, but then it's actually so empowering to say, yeah, I see that. And I am going to choose my I am that I am is going to choose that I am not that. And I am going to choose something else, even though all of this is available.
It's all available.
I am going to choose this.
Choices are power.
And that's so much more badass than being like, I just came out of the womb good and I'm all good. And that's me, the good guy. And that's just what I am. I'm just the good guy. No, you're not. You can be, and you can choose that, but it's so much more powerful when you're choosing it in full knowledge. It's like what Jordan Peterson says, like, you want somebody, and he's particularly talking about the masculine, but you want somebody who knows that they're a monster and has it under control and chooses how they show up in the world. You want someone that embraces that level of their power and then chooses to be good. Like that's what
it's
that's
more
what we
trustworthy.
really want. For sure. Because
Yeah.
otherwise those shadow expressions, they can grab the bull by the horns. And You don't even see it coming.
Yeah. It's like the shadow aspect of spirituality and thinking that we've transcended and it's all love and light.
Right.
That's part of it.
Yeah. You got half of it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying around feeling it all. It reminds me that my initial entry into ayahuasca was a prayer in a sweat lodge. I was going through a separation that would eventually become a divorce, and I couldn't feel anything. I was just stone cold. Our mediator said, "What do you want out of this?" And I was like, "I don't want anything. I just want out. I'm complete." And it just devastated my partner. And I knew that degree of coldness, I didn't want to live the rest of my life like that. And I just happened to find myself in a sweat lodge 2 weeks later, and I made a really concerted prayer, like, please, please help me open up my heart. I'm really cut off from my grief. I can only feel a tinge of anger, but I wouldn't really even let that surface. And a buddy of mine in that sweat lodge who actually took me to the lodge, we had just gotten to know each other as friends, who's now one of my best friends, Andy Swanson, up in Portland. He said to me, I think you might be interested in a medicine called ayahuasca. And I found myself 6 weeks later in a ceremony. And sure enough, that one first entry, I still remember it like it was yesterday, that first entry into Aya, I knew that was going to be a new trajectory for my life. And I did not know that the answer for that prayer was going to be a 9-year odyssey, and still to this day to a large degree, but a 9-year odyssey of uncovering all the trauma that had shut my heart off in the first place. And so that whole answer to that prayer, which was just like the drudgery of going through trauma work, didn't sound or feel like it was the answer to a prayer, because I thought opening my heart was going to be love. And yet I was uncovering all this trauma.
Yeah.
And also appreciating eventually what you just said, which is the opening of our heart means that we feel all of it. We're not just selective for feeling love. If we're opening our heart, that means we're going to feel all of it. The sadness, the betrayal, the rejection, the humiliation, the abandonment, all the core wounds of the soul, and the magnitude of the collective experience of trauma and pain and separation. So we get to feel it all. And then we get to self-select on what it is that we want to cultivate more of. Kindness, generosity, the metabolism of all of our trauma to eventually get to forgiveness, compassion, healing, and restoration. But we can't just jump to love and forgiveness without metabolizing the pain of the underlying trauma in the first place. Otherwise, we're just bypassing, which is a big shadow aspect of a lot of spiritual circles right now. Because yes, it is love and light, and that's only a sliver. It's only part of it. Can we avail ourselves to feeling it all?
And there's also a sticky little trap of, by defining yourself as other than, as separate than all the darkness, well then, of course, what do? You fight the darkness. And so it really locks you in this battle where you're in constant battle. And I've seen this as well, where it's like, we're the light warriors. We're the fucking light warriors, and we're out here attacking darkness. Well, you're just going to call darkness to you. It's an endless fucking pit. Like, let me assure you, there's plenty to go.
It will never go away. The adversary will always be there.
It can't. It just can't go away. And I think, there's myths that actually help point that way. One of the ones that I recently thought of was the fifth element, which is obviously a story that you can mythologize, of course. And there's this embodiment of absolute evil. And they say, what do we do? And we're like, well, let's launch our torpedoes into it. And they launch the torpedoes into it, and it just gets bigger. And they're like, what do we do about that? More torpedoes. And then it just gets even fucking bigger. And it's like, of course, you can't explode the darkness with violence, with tools of violence, and make it go away. It's just going to get bigger.
You can't vanquish darkness with darkness.
No, it's not the way it works. But you can alchemize it by applying the highest level of love, which is seeing actually, and they didn't do a great job of depicting this, because it looked like when Lilu actually slayed the darkness, it looked like she slayed it by this beam of light. It was like a superpowered laser that destroyed it. When really what that would have been is her loving that darkness too. And then the sparks of love that were hidden in the broken vessel and distortion of that darkness came alive. And the darkness realized that it was no longer, like the distortion was dispelled by the love that actually saw that kind of Christ-like love that said, I see God in you too. And that's what unconditional love does. And then the thing would have evolved. And that's really would have been a better way to do it. But I think for our psyches, we needed to destroy still. So we're very locked in this idea. And Avatar, same thing. Love that fucking movie. But ultimately the animals and the Awa destroying all of the machines and the men is not the way that story is told best. And I think there's a book that you turned me on to, The Fifth Sacred Thing, which actually tells the myth and tells the story in the way that's like a guide star for our world.
Yeah, can we see that darkness and say, you too have a sacred place at the table?
Yeah.
And stay with that, and stay with that, and stay with that. And in that story, that's the big schizophrenic moment where the agent of that darkness can't handle it.
Yeah.
And eventually.
So in this story, there's the Southlands, which is dystopia. It's imagine our world on steroids, where they breed people just to be prostitutes and children and deepest
and warriors
or warriors. So
the men are just the warriors, and the women
there's
are
other
just
there's other that
objects.
are like sadistic vessels that the wealthy people use, and it's like, imagine all of everything if it just went to its most absurd and insane, trajectory. where pedophilia and all of these things were normalized and brought into, and everybody who was wealthy had access to it. And it was this whole very deeply dark, and everything was bellicose and war, and the soldiers were bred to be mindless and just kill. And they interact with a classic utopian society of community and ritual and support and magic and a really beautiful, and it's a clash between both of them. And as the soldiers come up, the Northlands make a decision, a difficult decision that was, debated hotly, even still, like we should fight them, but like we can't fight them, it won't work. And eventually the elder women in the tribe, basically in the community, like we have to invite them for a seat at the table. And so they come in with all their guns, and then everybody in a unified voice is like, you have a seat at the table. And the battle turns, and it's a great book. It is a spoiler that I'm going to give, but it's important to illustrate this point because most of y'all won't read this book. But so I think one of the soldiers, they don't even have names. They've been dehumanized to the point.
Like
so they don't
0157.
I think it's 059. 59, I think is his name, but might not be that number. But whatever, you get the idea. And so 59 starts, he gets kind of aggravated, and he just starts shooting people. Shoots a woman in the head, shoots a child in the head. And every time somebody else takes the place of that person who is standing and says, you have a seat at the table. You have a seat at the table. Shoots another one. You have a seat at the table. You have a seat at the table. And that breaks his psyche. It's the moment where he can no longer hold the distortion anymore. Mm-hmm. And then he becomes he was kind of like the big, rough and tough bully badass in the army. And then he becomes, when he lays down his gun, everybody looks at him like, oh shit. And the tide of battle turns by causing all of the military to defect to the other side and say like, fuck this, we're done. Mm-hmm. And such a potent story that we don't see told very often. We still are locked in you win by killing all the opposition. I don't know.
Yeah, it's the most empowered experience that I've had in a narrative, in a storyline, to show the power of our transformation when we keep coming to the adversary with love and faith and a recognition that we hold a position that is unwavering. Whether it might be recently I went through a process where I realized my integrity is not for sale. My compassion is paramount. And the more complete story that you're describing in the fifth sacred thing is like our exalted position to become that which we know is possible. And we might also describe as like that's the inflection point, that when we can hold that position against all odds and all evidence to say that, okay, if I was that person in front of 059 and saying you too have a place at the table, can I take that position from absolute faith that in that moment, if my life too is in service to this transformative experience. She, Starhawk, in that book describes the full potency and potential of the transformative experience. Can I, if I'm just one agent of that transformative experience for the other, then I know that I'm serving my role.
Yeah.
And I also have to become right with my death.
Right. I mean, what that requires is a bodhisattva level of compassion and awareness. I mean, it's no easy task, and it's not applicable to every situation, right? Like you have a crazy person break into your house looking to kill you. Like I'm in my book, like defend yourself, because it's not like a concerted collective effort. It's as an individual attack, and every rose has a right to have a thorn. You know what I mean? Like, so it's not saying like, no matter what, turn the other cheek. Well, sometimes fucking smack back, like establish your boundary. But from a collective, like universal understanding of how to deal with the darkness, I think it's universally accurate. It's just specifically, occasionally, we have to make a different choice, and that other choice is justified. but it's definitely worth meditating, and I can't recommend that book more. Also, so many fucking amazing things in there, like the love temples that ultimately rehabilitate, the soldiers who had been indoctrinated in this other way, and helping them reconnect to the nature of the divine feminine, and like beautiful, scenes that we actually went over. A recent scene of that where he's getting bathed, and he's getting the 059 is getting bathed and turned on, and it's the most erotic thing where he's being fed figs or whatever it is, blindfolded, can't see anything, and there's this goddess that's attending to him, and he starts to get hard and engorged and full of lust, and everything he knows about lust is to then penetrate and then ravish that thing that he's lustful for, and objectify it to a certain degree, right? By like saying like, you are the vessel of my pleasure, not a divinely embodied portal, like whatever other language you want to use. He pulls the blindfold off, and it's an old crone, and he's like, holy shit. Like, I felt all this eros, all this erotic energy, and I cannot objectify you because you are, you're a crone. So it just like recalibrates everything, and reminds me of another story I heard from Matthias de Stefano about, I think it was Sumeria, or there was an old culture that he remembers. And when the soldiers or the warriors would go off to war, they would have to stop outside of the city and outside of where they were returning, and go to the love temples, where in Matthias's words, they would have the war fucked out of them.
Wow.
They would have the war fucked out of them. Like, you've been to some horrible, violent shit, and now we need to basically, and use the word fuck, but it's like
cleanse you
through
help you
lovemaking and eroticism and reconnection with your divine nature through interaction with the divine nature of the goddesses that were present there, priestesses.
A return to love.
A return to love, a return to Eros.
Wow.
So many things that we've forgotten in this world. And, I think one thing I want to definitely get to is you mentioned trauma, and trauma is like a universal experience to some degree. It just varies in degree, not in ubiquity. And one of the really promising thing that's come online is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Like, this is a big deal.
It's kind of a big deal.
It's a fucking big deal.
Yeah. Thankfully, we've been graced with the privilege to heal. And I think about many of our ancestors, our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., who didn't have many of these tools of consciousness and healing. And that's what I think about the medicine path in general, whether they're classic psychedelics or MDMA as an empathogen, iboga as an onerogen, all these different aspects of catalysts. Onerogen. Yeah, iboga is classically described as an onerogen, which means a dream-inducing medicine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Because in the experience of iboga, it's very much a dreamlike state where you oftentimes have the experience of coming to the threshold, contact with ancestors, contact with lineage, kind of like, I hadn't really thought about it before, what was that movie? Black Panther. Right, when he receives that soma and he crosses over and he goes and has a conversation with his dad. Very much, that's an onerogenic process.
It's funny because I, as I've talked about on here, I've gotten, a lot of incredibly powerful growth, spiritual growth and understanding from the combination of ketamine and cannabis, which prescribed the ketamine, and of course, thankfully, cannabis has at least been decriminalized here in Austin, which is great. But I remember one day I had taken an iboga microdose along with it. And I was like, something is different. And it was actually it was like a strong, because I was fasting that day. So the microdose was kind of like, it was a little bit peppier than usual. I was like, something is different. I forgot that I took it. I was like, something's fucking different in here. Something's different. And then I go straight to a scene that looked like Black Panther. And it's like, yes. And it was like this just, African culture that was there. And there's this old like warrior shaman. And he's like, that's right. I've been here the whole time. You forgot about me, but I've been here the whole time. And I was like, whoa. It's like, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Like, I forgot. It's like, that's right. You always forget that we've been here the whole time. So it was like in the micro and also the macro of like, oh yeah, you're our ancestors. We go back far enough. You're the cradle of civilization. This is where we all came from. And we can forget that. We can forget that culture that's been here the whole time, and we can all trace our roots all the way back. And Iboga, like in that Onirigan classic way, was like connecting me with that warrior shaman that was like giving me a stern lesson of like, don't you forget, son, been here. And he's pounding his chest. I've been here the whole time.
Whoa.
And I was like, deep bow. It was like fucking deep bow. And I was like, all right.
Right.
That's
Beautiful description of that onirogenic process and coming back into contact with our ancestors, talking about the cradle of civilization, all of our collective ancestors.
Yeah.
Iboga has that really unique fractal that consistently offers people. That's why oftentimes it's described as a crossroads medicine, crossing the threshold of consciousness over the arc of experience towards our ancestors. We might call that, like in the medicine wheel, the North Gate. And it also has this fascinating experience of being able to cleanse our physiology and our neuroreceptors to the extent that many of the clients that we would see down at Crossroads who may have been addicted to heroin or pain medications, opiates for decades, would go through one treatment. And through that one treatment would be cleansed of that addiction with no craving and no withdrawal on the other side. Like, there's no other medicine that quite does that on the planet like Iboga.
No.
And all these medicines have their own kind of unique fractal of potentiality and how they unlock these unique gates of our own consciousness. Cannabis will do that uniquely. Ketamine will do that uniquely. MDMA, LSD, San Pedro, 5-MeO, all these different keys to unlocking these unique gates, because we're all these multifaceted, complex iterations of consciousness. And as it relates to trauma, and bringing it back to that, MDMA and this privilege to heal, oftentimes we experience in the midst of an MDMA-supported therapy session. Or what I mean by that is, like, there are ways to use medicines recreationally and there's ways to use them therapeutically. And I've heard many stories of friends, family, clients, and others who have gone through an MDMA-supported process and have had the literal experience that they were working with a molecule that they had never been in contact with before.
Even if they've done it myriad times.
Recreationally.
I've had that experience.
Right.
I've had that
oh,
experience.
wow, recreational.
My first MDMA experience was in Australia with my girlfriend at the time when I was 21. Something like that. Amazing experience. Very like heart opening and opened up a lot of empathy and a lot of understanding, and it was great. But I was out at the clubs and we were doing things. I think I ended up like deciding to like eat a rose flower or something like that.
Very erotic.
It was like, oh yeah, look at this, everything bursting with life. It smells so good. And she's like, gee, you might want to chill out a little bit, like, and calm yourself. And then, then 30, or 15 years later, I'm 35 or something like that. And I get led through a proper MDMA assisted psychotherapy session with the blindfold, all of that energy that was pointed outward, pointed inward to the heart. Totally different thing.
Totally different. And coming into contact with how MDMA works is, you'd be hard pressed to construct a better molecule for trauma recovery work because of how MDMA works in the system. It softens the fear center. It accelerates our frontal kind of capacity, our witness perspective, and it solidifies even more actively the areas of the brain between memory and like the story or the narrative of a particular experience. So we have a more full memory of a particular trauma with better witness and less fear. So now we can see it more completely. Because oftentimes what's happening with people with PTSD, whether it's classic PTSD, like soldiers on the battlefield who are in an experience where they almost die, or they come into contact with just atrocious violence, witnessed or experienced first person. And then to go through this kind of recovery process that the psyche's trying to work through, but is stuck at the trauma, at the point at which it was so overwhelming that the psyche couldn't take it, so it walled it off. But the psyche's always trying to work towards resolution. Mm-hmm. So the resolution of that is the nightmares and the flashbacks and the constant re-experiencing of it, which keeps the nervous system in sympathetic overdrive, fight or flight, keeps the psyche in that fear response of feeling overwhelmed, but it can't quite get to resolution. So you have something like MDMA, and in that therapeutic process, the internal orientation, heart expansion, oxytocin, less fear, greater memory, better witness. Now I can see the whole thing. And not only the whole experience of that one traumatic event, but also the associated potential reasons that happened. More compassion for the perpetrator, more compassion for my position in it, more understanding of all the causative factors that led to it in the first place. So now I can work towards healing the trauma itself and working towards integrating that for full resolution, forgiveness, integration, healing, and kind of like becoming now a more complete whole self, because that traumatized part has now been rescued and brought home. The kind of like the protective archetypal imprint that's been holding that trauma at bay because it was too overwhelming. I didn't know it was going to annihilate me if I came fully in touch with it. That protective archetype can relax, knowing that now that traumatized part comes home, I can actually, in my more full, complete, mature consciousness, oftentimes supported with a therapist who's helping me work through it, because I'm not just doing that on my own. And I think MAPS has this well. It's the therapeutic process that's working towards resolution. The MDMA is just allowing it to happen more actively. Mm-hmm. It's not the medicine that's doing the work. It's the therapeutic relationship and the arc of processing it that's actually doing the work. The medicine just allows it to be more available.
Yeah.
And in that kind of like perfect neurochemical interpersonal process, now we have the opportunity to bring that trauma home. And the reason I call it the privilege to heal is our ancestors, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., didn't have the opportunity to work with these tools to heal their own trauma. And that trauma has been learned and propagated generationally. Passed along. Just like a learned behavior will be passed along. All animals have learned behavior passed along. That's what helps us continue to evolve. So we've also inherited all of these trauma patterns that now we have the opportunity and the privilege to heal. So it may not have started with us, but it's still ours with the opportunity to be made right, made whole, and then liberate the future generations from not having to carry my own unmet needs, my own trauma, that the future generations can just be who they're magically imbued and embodied to be, and hopefully collectively help us re-trajectorize this floating water rock into a more sustainable trajectory.
Mm-hmm. What is the mechanism that allows people to, I mean, it sounds like a very much of a protective mechanism, but so many people who've experienced trauma are unaware of their trauma, particularly sexual trauma or trauma that's happened in your childhood. I know so many people, and through this medicine path, have uncovered like deep, particularly sexual trauma, but not always sexual when they were younger. And it's interesting, it's interesting. And it makes, I've seen it so many times, both with men and women, don't think that this is just a female thing. It's not, it's absolutely not. But it's such a powerful force that even myself, I'm like, wait, like I'm all good here, right? Like,
what else don't I know?
Yeah, is there some funky shit that happened that I'm not remembering?
Right.
Because they literally will go from no recollection to sometimes a thread to sometimes like the veil is lifted and all of a sudden they can see all of it.
Yeah, a full trauma recovery process.
Right.
Spontaneous. It was
Yeah.
unknown.
Exactly.
It was so well defended
Mhm.
that it became completely out of the awareness of consciousness. It's a survival mechanism of the ego. We're built to survive. The ego is built to survive. And when we come into contact with something that feels overwhelming and annihilating, life-threatening, it can feel so overwhelming to our psychic structure, especially when we're little beings. And we're just the sponges of our environmental exposure. To have something that feels so antithetical to our sense of safety and wholeness and wellness of life, particularly if that trauma became, at that moment, the recognition that the person that I was entrusting the most with my life, like maybe mom, dad, or caregivers, or the priest, or whoever my association may have been, like that person's quote unquote God, or the supreme being, or the supreme kind of force environmentally in my life, if that person is now the bearer of my trauma, especially as a little being, we tend to think that we are the result and the cause of that. We're very egocentric as little people. And many of us are egocentric as old people too.
Yeah, never grew out of that phase.
Ideally, we become, more and more oriented towards moving from the me, mine, and the I to the us, the we, and the all, and it becomes less about us. But the way our psyche and nervous systems develop in those early stages, we are very egocentric. And when it becomes so overwhelming that, the supreme being in my life is now the bearer of such trauma, it can overload the circuit to blowing a fuse. And then at that point, it becomes walled off. And the protective mechanism of the ego comes in and kind of puts that memory on the back burner, or way in the closet, in the recesses of the subconscious, to be buried, to eventually, ideally, become made whole again. But until we're given the safe space to do that, with the medicines that allow the fear mechanism to significantly ratchet down in the midst of a safe, connected environment and interpersonal process of radical support, radical love, radical availability to, the therapist in that moment becomes like the external auxiliary orientation to self-compassion, just imbuing compassion where I might not be able to access it on my own, because oftentimes those deeply seated traumatic experiences have a lot of shame and guilt associated with them. So when that gets to be brought home and then met with love, ideally in the context of a therapist who knows that trauma recovery process, then it gets to rewrite that entire narrative towards more of like a truth moment. Like Don Howard would describe the medicine paths and the medicines themselves as clarigens, right? In that moment, we see the clarity of truth and how that trauma became to be, and how we were just a part of this whole thing playing out. Mm-hmm. And now that exiled part, now we're talking more about parts work or internal family systems work. That's the predominant psychotherapeutic orientation towards MDMA-supported psychotherapy, at least in the MAPS trials. Mm-hmm. Like Michael and Annie Mithofer, in those first phase 1 and phase 2 trials, the success rates were so good because they are so good in that therapeutic role. And they're so good, particularly with that internal family systems, which is parts work. We bring all the parts home, give them the talking stick and the microphone so that they can speak the traumatic experience into awareness, be validated from their own position. The rescuer parts of ourselves just trying to keep us safe. Yeah. The traumatized parts trying to figure out what the freak is happening here. The sense of overwhelm, the sense of shame, especially if it's sexual abuse when we're really young, then there's like this perverse pleasure that we're also feeling shame about, and it's so confusing.
I was able to sit in a really well-conducted, ceremony. Of course, these are underground at this point, so I'm not disclosing any details of that. It wasn't with you. If anybody's wondering if I'm giving cryptic notes to sitting in on one of your ceremonies, it was not you. I was sitting in, and it was a young woman who'd experienced a lot of sexual abuse from her father. And there was, of course, an immense amount of rage, so much rage that the rage would almost cause her to shut down. So there's both rage and shut down, and she was alternating between rage and being like shut down and immobilized in that paralyzation, the freeze impulse, and then the rage impulse. And then as she worked through that, and, you know, she was really masterfully handled through that whole process and allowed to give voice to all of the different feelings and all of the things that she was expressing, she eventually got to a place where she felt like she had to share something. And she's like, I'm so ashamed of this. It's like I'm trembling to even share it. But that when she would masturbate in her adult life, she would sometimes think of her father. And like that fucked with her psyche so deeply, because somehow the wires got crossed of pleasure and abuse and all of this. And then the shame was actually keeping her trapped in a lot of that. And of course, the facilitators were masterful at not even flinching at that level of shame and normalizing it and being like, yes, like all of this is possible and normal, and like there's nothing to be ashamed about that. And you could see this just weight, just peeling off of her. It was like beautiful. I mean, it was just like just tears just flowing of like, wow, like that was possible.
That's such a good description of the weight peeling off. That's what trauma is the psychic weight.
Yeah, and the weight and the energetic cost of holding up these walls. They're walling off aspects of your psyche and memory. And then what's happening, the festering that's happening behind the walls is one thing, but then also the energy required to keep a force field up, a force field impenetrable to our own recollection and perception. That's a lot of weight. So fatigue is another thing that you see in people who have these kind of things. It's like, why am I always tired? My diet's good. I'm working out. Why am I always tired? Well, you're tired because there could be many reasons, of course, and I don't want to be reductionist, but part of it is you're powering a force field, you know, and whatever else is going on, dealing with whatever other wounds that are going on behind that. But you're powering a force field. That's a cost.
Yeah, it's an energetic cost. It's constantly running.
Yeah.
It's like a program that's constantly running in the background that's just chewing away our like full life force psychic experience.
You talk about this in this book, A Dose of Hope. It's a good name. It's a good name because a lot of these, the trials that MAPS has run on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, particularly for veterans and first responders, the inclusion criteria for most people in the trial, they might have expanded it, but at least when I was following it, was treatment-resistant PTSD or trauma, meaning they've gotten a battery of different pharmaceuticals, 10, 12, however many it was, and whatever other treatments that were available that were not MDMA, all failed. So normally you wouldn't run a trial with people where everything else had failed. Like that's not how the pharmaceuticals run things, but MAPS is not that type of organization. They wanted to show that we're helping people that nothing else can help, which is, I think, also why they've been, gotten the FDA fast track status and gotten so much support, bipartisan support from everybody being like, well, fuck, you're helping people in a way that nobody's been able to help before. And it's really powerful, and it is hope for the hopeless.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. Thank you for that recognition. It's, I didn't expect to be in this position. I had been working with Aya for 8 years, underground work, still apprenticing. You and I were doing documentaries down south. And what kind of precipitated me coming onto the radar, so to speak, was my oldest sister's suicide. And just her just like warrior spirit and heart that tried everything to to rectify this deep PTSD that she had from her own childhood sexual abuse. We share the same father, and we grew up in different households. And in her mom's household, a family friend, or maybe a family member in that household, I don't remember exactly, because I wasn't connected with her family at all, her mom's side at all, had perpetrated this years-long sexual abuse. And she tried to anesthetize that with alcohol. And she had battled major depression and alcoholism, all as a consequence of this PTSD. And pharmaceuticals, antidepressants, AA, talk therapy, journaling, all that standard of care. And this is way back when we weren't speaking so much about psychedelic therapy for trauma, or at least I didn't know about it. This is, 9-10 years ago now. And when she died, I realized I can't just play from the sidelines anymore. You know, it was really like my call to action to be in an education advocacy position. And then I started exploring other medicines. First got me into ibogaine because she had such an experience with alcoholism. I wanted to understand the chief best medicine for addiction recovery, iboga, or ibogaine, its primary alkaloid. Explored that deeply, and then went into MDMA therapy, wanted to explore that deeply, understand the research. That eventually led to ketamine, explored that deeply, and wanted to understand its role for depression recovery as well as traumatic brain injury recovery, because ketamine is also very good for neuroinflammation related to brain injury. So I started exploring all these different medicines, and then realizing there's still so much to do in the education advocacy arena. And I wanted to be able to give people a dose of hope, to know that there are medicines available. We're doing our best to fast track them to legal therapeutic use at scale. And unfortunately, we still have brothers and sisters that are dying daily because these medicines aren't yet available. So we wanted to put the storyline into kind of an average person going through MDMA supported therapy, to kind of walk the reader through the process, and also to shine a light on this more contemporary appreciation for trauma, which is complex PTSD, which is classic PTSD, war experience, veterans on the battlefield. Complex PTSD, more like adverse childhood experiences over time of early neglect, maybe not so direct sexual overt abuse, but more of like the abuses of omission versus the abuses of commission. And these adverse childhood experiences over time set up the same kind of psychic structures and neurologic imprints that classic PTSD will do. So I wanted to demystify a little bit of the psychedelic psychotherapy, so we could kind of show it in a storyline, so as to offer a bit of hope to those that are really desperate and feel like there's nothing that's going to be helpful, to let them know that there are tools and we're doing our best. We still have a ways to go. Our nonprofit Thank You Life is kind of oriented towards that as well, as a psychedelic therapy funding stream to support people into medicine work that wouldn't be able to afford it on their own. Because at this point, when MAPS is able to push through MDMA therapy towards legal federal status, it's still going to be $10,000 to $15,000 per person per treatment series, because of the 3 medicine sessions with 2 therapists and 12 psychotherapy sessions around those. It's a lot of out-of-pocket expense. And at that price point, we're pricing out 95% of the population. So can we, as maybe some of us have gone through the medicine experiences and come back to wholeness and said, yes, thank you, life. Thank you for my life. Can I pay it forward so that somebody else can have that same kind of experience and come back to wholeness too?
Yeah. What would you say? I mean, there's going to be people listening, and I know they'll reach out, because whenever I talk about it, they do. They say, my brother just got back from service in Afghanistan. He's really struggling, or my father or my sister or maybe myself or whatever. they're looking for something to do now. Like they're in a waking hell.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's hard because like, I know what they can do, but they can't yet, It's like, it's not available. And it's tough. It's tough to know that, like, I know what's there. It's just, there's no place I can recommend you to go, I mean, if like we were deep family and I know the Underground Railroad, but I can't put that out online, and I that's not the way it works. It's like, it just doesn't work that way. It's not safe. There's a lot of people taking big risk, offering this and making this available now. So it's like, what do we tell? And then, so of course they could just try to take the medicine that they find from a dealer and figure it out. And maybe that would be productive, but it's dangerous waters to try and unpack the trauma on your own without
100%.
the guidance. It's not only just one therapist, it's two. It's a masculine and the feminine. And there's a particular way of mastery that really allows these positive outcomes. So you can't even really recommend that. So what do you do? And what do we do in this situation for people listening who are like, all right, cool, this is going to be legal in hopefully within 2 years. I just read something from Maps that, Rick had put out and saying like, looks like we're about 2 years out now, but that's a long time to be in hell.
It's a long time.
It's a long time. So like, what do you recommend when, the Underground Railroad option isn't available and, you're saying like someone really needs help and support right now?
It's such a good question. Yeah, thank you for asking the question. Thank you for putting me on the spot with the question because it's an important one. I think about the prelude of this question, which has been our conversation kind of up to this point. Like, how do we find faith through the process? How do we find connection and community through the process? So oftentimes in the midst of trauma playing in the background, we get stuck in isolation and blame and shame, and being able to connect to support the normalization of that process is key, is coming home to connection, having faith that this process is important. It is a path. It's one of the hardest paths to walk, trauma recovery, which is very much related to addictionology and our like orientation. We have such a high degree of addiction in our society. Gabor Mate, I think he's really right on when he says it's not the addiction that's the problem. The addiction's just a solution to the underlying pain.
Yeah, an attempt to solve the problem.
Right. So let's not ask why the addiction, let's ask why the pain. And then to bring that into connection. He has a process that he's been unfolding called compassionate inquiry, which is the opportunity to connect around the pain, give it voice, have enough of the associated practices that bring us some degree of buoyance and love and optimism and faith, and be surrounded by people that lift us up. Be really conscious of how we speak to ourselves. If I'm using language that continues to put me into this subjugated place of disconnection from my power, it's totally understandable, especially if I'm having the experience of trauma. So it's kind of like we're being our own internal coach. Like, what would our future selves tell our current selves if we were going through addiction recovery process or a trauma recovery process? What are the different ways that we can find inspiration and levity? For me, it was reading Viktor Frankl's work and understanding that he went through trauma that I will never know, and many of us won't ever know. And he was able to find meaning in it. So to know that there's a possibility for me, even though I might not be yet on the threshold of its full healing, I can still be on the pathway of my own recovery by anchoring to the best of my ability some degree of faith in the process that help is here, community is here, my own reclamation of my power is here. How can I access it? How can I come into contact with it, even if it's just for a brief moment? What are those aspects that bring me a little bit of levity in the dark storm? A little bit of inspiration when it feels like I've lost all hope? That's what I wanted the book at least to be, is just a little bit of a hope. And then an orientation, ideally to connect people with like-minded, like-hearted experiences of going through their own trauma recovery process, and having an elder and somebody to go to, whether it's a therapist or a council or a collective of a fellowship that has an elder present that can help us reconnect to our feelings, move those feelings, find aspects and avenues to discharge that emotion. Like Bessel van der Kolk says in The Body Holds the Score, Body Keeps the Score. Can we move it through? Can we find breath work?
Yeah.
Right? Stan Groff, he moved from LSD when that became illegal to breath work. That's a powerful tool for a therapeutic process, a cathartic process. Can we find ways to express it, to continue to allow the stuck energetic to find its avenue? You know, this is going to sound a little cliched, but like to the light.
Mm-hmm.
That dense, heavy energy, can we find that avenue to the light? And it's not, I can't not say that if my sister was alive right now and MDMA was not legal, that I would not do my best to help her find avenues for treatment.
Of course.
And if that meant the underground community, I would use every tool in my toolkit and every available avenue for healing available. And to your point, it's like, how do we do that? Because those are dicey waters. So it's kind of like if somebody's been starving in the desert and I offer them water, you know, first and foremost, I'm going to offer them little sips of water so that they can rehydrate. If I offer them a gallon of water to reconstitute, that's actually going to do more damage than good. So we're finding that sweet spot of having the opportunity to normalize the conversation of what trauma is and how much we are all experiencing some degree of trauma, whether it's our own or the collective. And how do we have these kind of conversations and touch points with other people and find the ways that are called for each of us to at least start chipping away at it, become curious, become available. And if somebody is, I really appreciated like you contacting the depth of a person's pain when you receive that email. And I've received those emails. Sonia receives some of those and she comes back to me in tears and she's like, how do we help this person? Yeah. Like, okay, well, let's do our best. And I'm still a firm believer that the trajectory of our like evolution in consciousness has these superhero sign-up moments that just feel atrociously heavy and weighted and burdened. And it can feel overwhelming to the point that we want to give up. And I've been there myself. And if we can make a prayer and we can really ask, okay, very much, I need help right now. Send me something, please. Whether it's a vision, an inspired thought, a connection with another. For me, it was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning just graced my altar. But it was because I made that prayer. And I very much believe in the power of our prayer and the power of our intention. And I know many people have been suffering for a long time in prayer, and they're going to hear this and say, I've been doing that. What else do you have? And my hope is that our conversation can just be another one of those answers, that we know that we have available tools. And in the long kind of trajectory of us healing the entire propaganda of anti-drug, your war on drug kind of like political motivations, even showing in the recent Netflix series, How to Change Your Mind, we're still rehabilitating that as a culture.
Yeah.
And we're all experiencing the downstream karma and negative imprinting of that propaganda. So unfortunately, we're trying to rehabilitate 30 years of lost time in psychedelic research and rehabilitating the political landscape. And it's very much why I appreciate you doing the work that you do and championing the cause and sending out this message to humanity of the right use of medicine work. And the fact that, too, the medicines aren't here to fix us. They're here to just show us our truth, which is already the inherent wholeness that lives deep within. And we do need these catalysts for consciousness to spark that flame of remembering. And it can feel really overwhelming when we don't have that catalyst immediately available. So that was a roundabout way of saying, please, if you're listening and you're finding yourself in the darkness, may this conversation be just one little moment of optimism and hope, and stay in the prayer.
Yeah.
Stay in the prayer.
And a lesson about prayer is from Yeshua, pray as if it has already been done, because you can get stuck in a trap of praying from a position that reinforces your lack, reinforces the opposite of what you are. Like, I'm so broken, I need help. That is the different way to pray. It's not actually the prayer that actually creates it, which is acknowledge what is true, of course. You don't need to bypass it, but so it would be, I am broken and I'm going to get help. And I've, thank you, universe, thank you, life, for the help that is coming that has not yet arrived. And so changing your prayers in that way, and I think is going to make your prayer so much more powerful. And then just to summarize that, very beautiful way that you phrase everything: one, community, find people that you can talk to. Breath work is legal, available, and something that's extraordinarily powerful. Ketamine therapy is coming online as well, and that's a possibility and a potentiality. I remember, I think it was Rick Doblin himself who said that it's not as effective as MDMA in treating these things, but it gives you enough space as a dissociative, gives you enough space that you can actually start to work with some of these things. If you have a good therapist, you can start to work with some of these things without feeling the pain and fear and panic that it can bring up. So that's another option. And, most importantly, just keep the faith that the allies, Gandalf's coming on the hill, with the shining staff, and the orcs may look like they're going to overrun the keep, but just hang on. If you can make it just a little bit longer, all the tools will be available. And hopefully, again, it's such a beautiful philanthropic endeavor, your Thank You Life nonprofit that you're in the process of formulating. But also, hopefully, the government gets some sense, and our insurance companies get some sense, and this is covered by basic insurance, just like getting a 12 pharmaceutical prescription that you're on for the rest of your life is covered by pharmaceutical care. Like, if you really actually want to talk about curing people and actually, ending this weight of debt that we continue to build in all of these different systems, how much we're spending on medicine that's not working, hopefully, even the insurance companies themselves will be like, all right, well, this works out better for us in the long run rather than paying $1,000 every month for all these pharmas. We can actually cure people in 3 sessions. And so it's actually better for us from a business perspective and from a national perspective to actually fund these from insurance. So I know MAPS is working hard on that as well. So hopefully, because we have to democratize healing, fundamentally, it can't just be for a few. It has to be for everybody, because we're all in this together, and anything else is bullshit. Amen. Amen. I love you, brother. To the end, hermano.
Till the end, brother. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, Absolutely. Anywhere else? I know you're finally posting on Instagram. It took me like fucking 8 years of nagging you, but you finally got an Instagram that's doing stuff. I see little quotes that come up and things. Good job.
I'm still a recovering Luddite.
It's at Dr. Dan Engle, right?
Yeah.
And any other websites or anything you want to point out to people?
Yeah, thankyoulife.org. As mentioned, Full Spectrum Medicine is our psychedelic education and integration platform. There are a few other things brewing, but those are the two big ones right now.
Cool. And A Dose of Hope, available on Amazon.
Yeah.
And probably other places. But right on.
Yeah, brother.
Love you, brother. Para bien de todos.
Para bien. I love you too, man.
See everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning into this video. Make sure you hit subscribe. Follow me at Aubrey Marcus. Check out the Aubrey Marcus podcast, available everywhere. And leave a comment. Let me know if this video resonated or what else you would like to hear from me in the future. Thank you so much.